Hi, my name is Neil Isco, and today we've got a webinar entitled Being Right When You Think You're Wrong. Now, this webinar is part of a series, and we encourage you to go back and look at some of the other content as all these webinars fit together. Let's start with goals. Achieving the goal is increasing conversions.
And so today what we're going to talk about is the strategy, and within the strategy is a plan. Tactics, that's the way you get to the plan. And then along the way, there are decisions that you make, and those decisions have consequences. So let's start off. Our goal, increase conversions. Strategy, experiment. So the mantra is always be testing, so let's test. And here's a tactic. Let's talk about a null hypothesis test and 95% significance. Now this talk is not going to be a statistical talk. What I want you to do is to think high level. This is about what we're doing when we do a test. So everybody's been through this drill. You start with a sample size, and you get that sample size from a calculator. But what I want you to pay particular attention to is the things that you need to get that sample size. So you need a rate for the control. Some people call that a null hypothesis. Rate for the variant, and that's your B, the alternate hypothesis, and a significance level. So you get that, and you start the experiment. And then when you're done, you make a decision. So here we go. We've tried a variant, a B, and we've tried it against the control, the A. And now we're going to make a decision to either accept the variant, which is also known as rejecting the null hypothesis, or we keep the control. We don't reject the null hypothesis. So it's not that black and white, because the reason that we're going through these statistical tests is because there's uncertainty. What we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, given what we know, how to make a decision. And this is a particular kind of decision. It's a binary, a yes-no decision. So let's look at other decisions that are out there. Here's the decision, guilty or innocent. So justice is served if an innocent person's freed and a guilty person is convicted. But what do you do when you don't know? And you really never know. So a miscarriage of justice is if a guilty person goes free or an innocent person is convicted. So those are two mistakes you can make. So there are four outcomes. You can be right in two different ways. And if you look in the green boxes, so we could free an innocent person or convict a guilty person. But now let's look at the two kind of errors you can make. In the red boxes, we could set a guilty person free, or we could convict an innocent person. Now the little box that you've got here is sort of they call it a number of different things, but it lays out a truth table. So if the truth is in the last two columns, not guilty or guilty, and then the jury finds not guilty or guilty, that's what leads to these four outcomes. And those outcomes are the same type of choices in an A/B test. So in a control or a variant, the truth is, and this is independent of what you test, is the control better or is the variant better? So that's at the top right two columns. So then the test finds either for the control or the variant, and your choices are this: you keep the control or you think the variant is a winner. But now let's look at these two red boxes. When we talk about A/B testing, typically we talk about type 1 error. So when people talk about statistical significance, what they're typically talking about is the type 1 statistical significance. So this is the error that you make if you accidentally say something is correct, it's better than the control, but you're wrong. Now type 2 errors are trickier. And let's go to the shepherd boy and the wolf and talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. So we've got two possibilities for truth: no wolf or wolf attack. And if you remember the story, there's actually two different things that happen. At the beginning, the shepherd is shouting wolf attack. That would be the bottom row. But if there's no wolf, then it's a false alarm. And in the case of the shepherd, false alarm means that if you get enough false alarms, then maybe people don't trust you. And so the next time this shepherd says that there isn't a wolf, and in fact, there is a wolf. And so now you have a second kind of error, the type 2 error. Now, the thing about these errors are, they're inversely proportional, which is a way of saying that if one goes up, the other goes down. So you can't just reduce type 1 and 2 errors sort of arbitrarily. In general, they both exist in the presence of uncertainty. And the key is how you want to interpret your results. So you could decrease both, but the way you decrease both is always essentially by gathering more information. So if you think about increasing the sample size, and that's the way this typically comes up, is everybody knows that the bigger the sample size, the easier it is to prove significance. And so typically speaking, that's what people think about, increasing the sample size. But there are two other things. Another one is to increase the size of the effect. And the third one is to reduce the actual noise in the data. We're going to talk about these. So before we go any further, let's talk about the granddaddy of all A/B tests, and that would be FDA clinical phase 3 testing. And oftentimes when people learn about hypothesis testing, this is given as an example, because the FDA doesn't want a drug to be approved that's ineffective. And so you have all these different cases where people think, well, gosh, this drug might work. It could work. It's saving people. It saved my brother, or it saved someone in a particular test, and how come we can't roll it out? And what the FDA says is we want to be absolutely positively sure that the variant, the drug, is better than the control, not just as good as, but it's better than. And that's within the context of drug development. So if you look at drug development, and the reason I'm talking about context here is context is key to how people use these types of tests. So most of drug development is about exploring. When drug companies find drugs, they're not using A/B tests. They're using a variety of techniques, microarray screening techniques, all sorts of techniques that are generally lumped in the category of exploratory statistics. Taking a drug to market is well over a $1 billion process. It takes well over 10 years, and only a small part of that are confirmatory tests. Most of it's exploration. I showed a big box for exploratory and confirmatory, but really between the two is sort of more exploratory. So the way drug manufacturers do it, what they know is if they're going to ever pass the confirmatory test, in order for the A/B test to work, they darn sure better find something that has a big effect. Not sort of a marginal effect, but a big effect, something that the test will see. Because when you think about it, these tests, they're nothing special. The A/B test is about trying to see if the result that happens is better than chance. The A/B test isn't telling you that something is better than something else. It's really telling you that a result is different than chance. And so in terms of the better than, that's established in other ways. It's established in these exploratory tests. And the confirmatory tests, that's to, in the end, make sure that all of your preliminary tests work. So the real question is like, why am I talking about this? Why bother? Well, it turns out that this can help you. This can help you quite a bit. And it can help you increase conversions. So let's go back to what we started talking about, which are these strategies and tactics and decisions and consequences. The A/B test, it's a tactic. So our goal, once again, is to increase conversions. And one way we could do that is we could say, okay, here's an A and here's a B, and now let's run this statistical significance test, and we'll see what happens. The trouble with it is that the data can lead to paths that are beyond pass-fail. I mean, typically you hear, okay, the test failed, you know, it's too bad, but maybe there's some learnings that can happen. Let's think about whether the button color should have been a different color, or the size, or any one of a number of things. And that's good to do. But there's more that you can do with the data. And in order to understand what you can do with the data, I want to drill down a little bit more into what's going on behind the scenes with these statistics. Now, this is not a statistical talk, and so if you're not into the numbers, then just kind of stick high level. So we'll talk about this in two levels. The first thing is a point that we talked about earlier, which is the statistical significance, the ability to declare something significant. It depends upon sample size. So if we have a control that's at 1% and a variant that's at 1.4%, that's a 40% improvement. It's a 40% improvement if you have 1,000 visitors. It's a 40% improvement if you have 2,000 visitors. It's a 40% improvement if you have 5,000 visitors. And it's a 40% improvement if you have 10,000 visitors, but it's 10,000 visitors that are required to prove it significant. But think about that. 10,000 visitors, my gosh, maybe what you know, depending upon how much traffic you've got in your site, 10,000 might be a precious number. And the question overall then becomes, at a high level, is how do you want to spend your time? How do you want to spend your resources? And could I do something else with some of those visitors? So let's look at behind the scenes why this test failed. So on the left, conversion rate, and you can see that at 1,000 visitors, controls 1%, variance 1.4%, but the bars are taller, and this is called the confidence interval. And a confidence interval is just another way to look at the way that the data, the kind of inferences you can make from the data. So in the 1,000 visitor case, at a 95% level, which for those of you who are into the kind of thing, that's a z-score of 1.96 or 1.96 standard deviations from the mean. And that's in the 1,000 visitor case, it's a wider bar. In the 2,000 visitor case, the bar gets a little bit shorter. In the 5,000 visitor case, it's shorter still. Now, in order for it to be statistically significant at a 95% level, the bars would have to not be touching. But let's look at what you could get from this. Even without having statistical significance, at the 2,000 level, and certainly at the 5,000 level, you got a pretty good indicator that this is likely to be significant or could be significant. So what if you just stopped at an earlier point, put this on a shelf, or more appropriately in front of you, and then started a different test with this traffic to get another piece of information? The next thing is statistical significance depends upon the size of the effect. Now, these interpretations come from the academic literature, and what academicians, in particular, a guy named Cohn in this case, said, well, look, there are small effects, medium effects, large effects, and depending upon the effect size, that's going to affect how easily we can find statistical significance. And so in this case, we've got the same graph with 1,000 visitors, 2,000 visitors, and 5,000 visitors. But look, in the previous example, 1% and 1.4%, no matter whether we fed them 1,000, 2,000, or 5,000 visitors, we couldn't prove significance. But with 2%, a bigger effect, we can prove it at 2,000 visitors. And this of course makes sort of intuitive sense, because if there's a bigger effect, then the evidence is going to be clearer. It's going to present the information in a simpler fashion. And so what we're trying to find, after all, is think about the goal. The goal is increased conversions. So if you can find things that have large effects, well, statistical significance is pretty easy to prove, because if you've got a large effect, you're going to consistently get that large effect, and then you'll be able to prove the significance. Now, another thing that affects this is the ratio of signal to noise. And what does that mean? Well, look at it this way. Let's say you've got a 1% conversion rate. So for every 100 visitors that visit your site, only one of them converts. So what does that mean? Well, 100 comes in and you get one conversion, so that's 1%. But what if by some fluke, you got 2 visitors in that 100? Is your real conversion rate 2%? Maybe, but only if every 100 you get 2 now instead of 1. And the problem is because there's so many negatives for every positive, that's a lot of noise. It's hard to tell exactly what's going on. And you can see that here, where with a control of 1 and a variant of 1.4, we have a 40% improvement and no statistical significance. But by going simply from a 1 to a base of 10, so now we have a control of 10 and a variant of 11. So our improvement is 10% instead of 40%. No, that doesn't sound all that great, but it turns out that because we're working at a 10% level, meaning that now for every 100 visitors that come in, 10 of them convert. That's less noise. And so even with a smaller improvement, sort of, this is not opposite of what I said previously, but it's another factor to consider. With only 10% improvement, I can prove statistical significance, and I can do it with 2,000 visitors. So I've thrown a lot of things out here. The net of this is it's about exploration, and it's about the decisions that you make while you explore. So returning for a second to the example on a jury. Justice once said that it would be better to incorrectly let 10 guilty people go free than it would be to convict one innocent person. So the standard is high. The standard in the justice system is very high, and the standard for an A/B test for confirmatory statistics like an FDA approval, it's high. It's a really hard barrier, and when you get it, you know absolutely, positively that in fact it was significant. But let's go back to the justice system. So this thing, guilty beyond the shadow of a doubt, a hard type 1 error, that's for criminal trials. But there's a different system in the country called a civil trial. And in a civil trial, the standard is different. The standard is preponderance of evidence. So in a civil trial, to win a civil trial, you don't have to be absolutely positively sure that the opposite side is true. It's just that the preponderance of evidence, the data that you've got, shows you that, okay, I think that this side should win. And you can work this also into your conversion optimization practice. So looking at the data, instead of slavishly doing a confirmatory test and expecting that to yield you instant results, is a way that you can, given the constraints of your traffic, given the constraints of your practice, be able to get more information. And this is not to knock the confirmatory test. That's a great thing, A/B test. But the suggestion is to do that at the end, after you've done some exploration, after you've found some things that could be right, because our goal, after all, is to increase the conversion. And the resource that's typically limited is the amount of traffic that comes in, the amount of time you have, the patience of your customers. In order to give everyone gains, exploration is key. So with that, hopefully I've given you some things to think about. Let's take some questions. Oh, and I must say that we've been playing with these concepts at Sentient for a very long time. And if you're interested in talking to some folks who can tell you about a product that uses these techniques, send information to ascend@sentient.ai. Questions?
If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button down at the bottom of your webinar, and we'll go ahead and take questions as they come in.
And while we're waiting on that, the concept of back to type 1 and type 2 errors, it's a subtle thing. These things do trade against each other, and they when most people learn about statistics, all they learn about is this type 1. In a future webinar, we're going to talk about the power of a test and why the power of a test is a critical factor, and the power of a test is derived from the type 2 error. But it's not so much, and what I urge you in your practice is to make sure that you understand at a high level what's going on, and that's much, much more important. You'll get much, much better results than if you simply cookbook it and try sort of slavishly to go to significance. It's not what the drug companies do. It's not really what anybody who's doing the typical research to try to find an effect, whether it's a pharmaceutical effect, a sociological effect, psychological effect. The whole mechanism of these testing is first about exploration and then about confirmation. So the other takeaway is it's about exploration to find the things, and then it's about confirmation to verify. Okay, so we've had a couple of questions that are asking sort of a similar thing, which is, how do you apply this concept of exploration to A/B testing? Are you exploring multiple variants for single control? And the answer is yes. So let's just talk about how to get more out of your testing practice. Let's just take a typical thing. So you think, wow, I've got this hypothesis, and it might be that whatever it's going to be on the web page variant, and you run the thing, and you think, gosh, I could have sworn it looks like it should convert. I've been peeking at the results, and it's almost there, but it hasn't quite converted. And so the suggestion, instead of trying to wait an extra month and hope that you just get enough visitors in that will push it over this conversion barrier, that's not really what you're supposed to do statistically anyway. It's supposed to be a black box. And so the suggestion here is stop. Say, hey, this looks like an interesting result, and then try your next variant. And continue until you've got sort of a handful of variants, and then go back, look at what's going on, maybe even do some combination of the variants, and then try again. So there's no requirement that along the way you have to have statistical significance. You could do it that way, but that burns a lot of traffic and doesn't necessarily get you where you want to go. So in the case, which is for most people always the case, where you're limited in terms of resources, where the resources are visitors, time, dollars, customer acceptance, then what I'm advocating is more testing to get an idea of what works, and then full confirmation. There's another thing which is important here, and that's the context that this is being used in business. So in the drug case, the FDA doesn't want a landscape littered with drugs that are kind of all the same effectiveness. They want to approve a drug unless it's better than the previous drug. But in the business case, something that is as good as is just fine. As long as it's not worse than, then as good as is just great. But the standard for statistical significance is it has to be absolutely better than. And so it turns out that in your conversion optimization practice, you will get, if you lessen your standards slightly, your results will be better for your customer, which is to say that when your goal is to raise conversions, you can do that in any way that is either as good as your existing control or better than your existing control. High barriers in testing. Yeah, so the high barrier is that the null hypothesis test It's the gold standard for a reason. It's the gold standard because there's all sorts of things that have to be present for it to work. And this talk is not about sort of assumptions of A/B testing, but at a high level, there are things that about the population, about randomness, about various things that tend to muck up the results. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but it often happens, or it happens more than occasionally, that you have a test that's run to statistical significance, and then you implement that test, and everything's okay for a week or so, and then, but a month later, you look, and now you're back to where you were before. So what went on then? Was the test wrong? Well, in some cases, it's because the traffic changed, or the season changed, or the environment changed. And in some cases, it's because the test gave you some sort of spurious results. And once again, this is not the talk for statistics, but at a high level in business, you got to go with what works, and you've got to do it quickly. And that's the way that you're going to keep your customers and continue to deliver value to them. And with that, hope you enjoyed the webinar. We've had a series of these. Thank you.